Good morning, watchers. Welcome to Brother Sal's Sunday Gathering at the Storehouse, our weekly commentary on world events. We first started in 1996 and have become more relevant ever since. Today, posting 2 shows per week to our YouTube channels, BroSal and Philadelphia Church. For 20 years, we have integrated the historical landscape that unfolds daily with the prophetic analysis anticipated by eschatology. We bring you non-traditional insights and uncensored discussion of issues purposely ignored by media of all kinds. Join us now for the only discussion of its kind. And joining me again this week is my son, Tony. Welcome, Tony. What do you have for us?
Good morning, Dad. Thanks for having me on the show. So much going on this week that it's really it's hard to keep up with, and I think it's important to consider the context, like I've been harping on, I think, for some time. What's really going on in the world that all these headlines fit into. I watched a couple things on YouTube this week. One of the people that's got the best story, I think, out there that you're liable to find in media is called Ken O'Keefe, and he's not totally unknown, but he doesn't, you're not going to see, they don't put him on too many of the big shows anymore because he's very radical. He's about the most radical view that you're going to hear. And I think Ken is, most of what I hear from him, Dad, I think is 100% right. You put something on Facebook some time back and you said, hey, this guy sounds like you. And yeah, Ken O'Keefe does sound like me, but here's the difference, and here's why I think, that your show is so valuable, and that our insight, taking the eschatological view into consideration, because Ken doesn't capture that. Ken really, what he sees, and the reason I mention is, we've mentioned him before, but probably not as much as he deserves, because he's really been calling a spade for years in the Palestinian-Israeli issue, because that's where he's coming from. He sees that this whole plan of which America is joined at the hip, that goes back this 100 years to the Balfour Declaration kind of timing, as I'm always pointing out, modern history ties into the last 100 years, and it's for that land. This is where he's coming from, that the Greater Israel Project, I believe it's called, where they're looking to spread Israel from the Euphrates to the Nile, which occupies, basically all of Egypt's heartland, valuable land, all the way through to part of Syria and Iraq. That all that will one day be Egypt, everything in between. Israel. That will all be Israel. And how that can't just be thrown out on some international level as an absurdity, as nothing the international community could ever accept. Why you'd even propose that in a land full of other people and other countries. But it's amazing how you can see the history going that way from Ken O'Keefe's point of view, and all this terrorism, and the people like Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and the people that are all on the side of Israel, and all on the everybody with the guns over there, and the persecution that's been going on in Palestine, which he's been reporting on for many years, how lopsided the mainstream view has been, showing poor Israel getting suicide bombers, and he's been showing for a long time, that Israel overpowers the Palestinians at every opportunity, and does incredibly more damage to them than it's ever done going the other direction. So anyway, Ken O'Keefe I was listening to, and it's because he had something out in the last week or two that was sort of a summary from his point of view of what's going on in the Middle East. So I encourage people to check that out. It was about 7 minutes long or 8 minutes long, Dad. And his point of view is just what I'm extrapolating here. And now, as a context, it gives a lot of meaning to what's going on in the world. When you look at the American powers that be are funding this takeover of that land through Israel. That's why Israel's got all the weapons, and the only other people that have the weapons are the friends of Israel fighting against the people who still have land and don't want to give it up to Israel. And those are the radicals. Those are the terrorists. He points out that ISIS is a CIA-funded mercenaries, that this isn't a grassroots organization of Islamic people that are radicalized at all. That this is so he has a lot of good information on all that, and so it helps fit all of our headlines into a context. But now into that, then, see, he has Russia and China as these true enemies, and this war that's coming, that's being brought on just by the sort of pig-headed, how would you call it, Dad? The fact that they've decided they're taking that land for so long ago now, that the plans are too deep. There's no turning back. It's one of those obstinate positions where they're just going to keep pushing no matter what, and that's going to bring about worse conflict. See, that's his position. He's not pointing to the fact that that's been prophesied about, at least by William Guy Carr, in the sense of from 1958, this Third World War that was going to be stimulated between the Muslims and Israel, and that some scourge was going to get so bad that the whole citizenry of the world was going to have to respond, and that the culmination of all of this is that the godless atheists were going to be unleashed against the Christians, and both were going to annihilate each other and see that their ways were fruitless. That was going to open the door for a new sort of beginning. Okay, that's what at least goes back to 58. Now, that puts a lot of things into a little deeper context. Then you have the religious context that you'll get from someone like a Sheikh Imran Hossein, or from us, an eschatological context in which the religious monotheists are expecting a false Messiah of the Jews, some spirit of which has been at work in the world, whatever that means, for some thousands of years, perhaps the last 2,000 years, already doing something, forming something from behind the scenes that you don't see in the third dimension except as its result. See, and to me, part of that is this, as I've said before, Dad, all these leaders that wear a suit and a tie work for the banks. You know what I mean? That's part of this antichrist system when you look at it from the people that are reading it on an eschatological level, looking for prophecies to come true and seeing a spiritual realm. So, I'm trying to tie together these contexts for what they're worth, that you do have this eschatological look through prophecy, expecting a false Messiah of the Jews to arrive to precede this great war. You have this look from someone like William Guy Carr, who points, backwards toward this being a much older look, but I like to reference it from there because you can't, I've seen so much stuff trying to undermine the prophecies of Albert Pike. And there's a lot of hype about that on the internet, Dad. And so I don't know. How do I know if these are real prophecies or not? What I know is William Guy Carr printed it in his book, claiming to have got it from something else that was printed in the 20s from this cardinal who says that he saw this stuff, that he first encountered it in the teens, I believe it was, the early 20th century, in a museum in England, National Museum or something, National Library, something like that, and that it was since taken out, which the museum or library, whichever it is, denies it was ever there. So there's all this controversy. So there's all the naysayers that say, it's a bunch of crud. There was never any such prophecy as Albert Pike. And so I'm saying, okay, I don't know. There just happens to be a statue of old Albert Pike there in the area of the White House, right? Of all the people to make statues of, not too many Confederate generals, but Albert Pike's there, funny enough. So I don't know what that means. The fact that he was the head of a Masonic lodge, I don't know what any of that means really, in the sense of, did he write that letter? Is that actual? All I know is by 1958, William Carr put it in a book. And what he claims that all of this said, that he is reporting, is that it says there'll be a third war, 3 world wars, but by then 2 of them could have been fictionalized accounts of what had already gone on. But it certainly, when you come to 50 years later now, 55 years, going on 60 years since William Guy Carr's account, boy, the world was a different place 60 years ago when he was writing that book, wasn't it, Dad? As far as predicting Israel and the Muslims would be the ones that would be fomented, and that would bring in this atheist regime, because remember, the Second World War was all to build up this atheist regime, which was introduced in the First World War, in the way Guy Harvey's representing the 3 world wars that were predicted. So it fits that narrative, but if it's just a fictionalized narrative, right? Whoever said back in 58, when it looked like, after World War II, the Allies had won, the communists were, all of that was going to be defeated and turned to freedom and liberty, and right? We were having when I say we, the Allies, the West, the people that won World War II were, we're talking about how to divide up the world. So as far as this predicted world war that was to come, where the atheists were going to rise and become so strong, in the 50s, that's not how it looked. Fascism was defeated, and so anyhow, I'm just trying to show the layers of context the way I see it that makes sense. You got Ken O'Keefe, which is more on the level of a Professor Carroll Quigley, pointing out there's some rich son of a guns that run the banks that want to have the world their way and run every kingdom. And the modern argument points through a guy like Ken O'Keefe to what they're doing with that money is they built all these companies that make weapons, and they're defending this. They want that land over there where all the oil is in the name of the state of Israel. That's what they're doing. They're going to kill off all the Arabs to get it. And so did they predict, therefore, from much earlier, these same people with all the money, that they would do it through 3 world wars? Or is it just or is that just somewhat coincidental in an Orwellian fashion of writing science fiction of the future, 1984? How long ago was that written? And before the surveillance equipment was really available, and now we talk about it as if it's, our every cell phone call is being monitored and all that kind of stuff. So what's that all really, how's that fit into Guy Carr's account of things? It's for everyone to decide. But for me, in reading these headlines and stuff now, it all becomes clearer when you start to layer these contexts of things that's going on, and you start from the surface layer where there appears to be this huge amount of money going into Israel terrorizing their neighbors, and the support of that through giving the money to the neighbors that support that, like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt for a while before they were destabilized. And that all this destabilization is in an effort to expand this greater Israel project, for that whole land is eventually going to be Israel. And now that fits into this idea of an antichrist kingdom, right? False deliverer is going to come. He's the one that's going to lead the Jews in place of the true deliverer. So they're setting that up. He's setting that up. The spirit of Antichrist in the background in history is bringing about an actual kingdom on earth that he's going to rule through the spirit, through the people he's bringing up in the way that God said he'd do it through David, or prophesied, or the prophets prophesied that it would happen through the kingdom of David. So on that level, and in that, we've been talking about, Israel's back sort of in the headlines. I mean, they're never out of the headlines, but I look at the stuff that comes across my radar as being thrown at me as what they want me to see. And as we talked about for almost a month there through the holidays, they want, it was nothing. It was none of these issues, all celebrity stuff, all pop culture. Now it's back to the issues. But funny enough, Dad, it's not terrorism so much these last couple of weeks. It's Turkey, it's Korea, it's the Palestinian-Israeli issue, it's the migrant issue, and it's the Pope now. So this first one, from what I'm talking about with Ken O'Keefe, EU calls on Israel to halt demolition of Palestinian housing. And this is from Saturday, February 6th, AFP, no name on it. EU calls on Israel to halt demolition of Palestinian housing. And it just, points out that foreign ministers from 28 EU nations had confirmed, quote, the EU's firm opposition to Israel's settlement policy, unquote, and criticized the actions, including demolitions, confiscation, and forced transfers. So it's interesting in this whole peace process, and yet the people that, the 28 member nation EU is not happy, but that doesn't stick. Doesn't really make it. Israel shrugs it off. How come Americans aren't? I see that as a little bit, BS, Dad. A little just trying to make a show, like, the EU's all against it. How come that doesn't matter? Where does Israel get all their support? If Europe's against them, how come America's not against this expansion when everybody's trying to talk peace? Why is that going on if something more like Ken O'Keefe's presentation of the facts isn't what's going on? That the people with the real money are behind this greater Israel project to just keep, so they're fomenting this hostility, knowing that it keeps presenting more and more reason to keep fighting, to keep pushing their neighbors into war, which is what they want. See, that's the position of those people that are on the Zionistic train, that this is what it's all about. See, I say that the eschatological view from both Islamic and Christian points of view and Jewish shows that the Zionistic train doesn't end well. They get destroyed, right? The Quran has them overrunning Jerusalem. The prophets of the Jews have them overrunning Jerusalem. The Christians have them overrunning Jerusalem. Only a remnant being fleeing to a place prepared for them. And the prophecy, if he hadn't spared a remnant, there'd be none of that race left to save. So that's what's coming from an eschatological view that people like Ken O'Keefe don't take into account, see? But I watched something else that did this week, and I tell you who it was, but I can't remember exactly who it was, and I don't want to give out any wrong information. But it was a good presentation of the material, so I'll try and find it and maybe talk about it another time, or who put it up there. But it drew together, it got a little monotonous because it drew together a lot of the headlines being talked about on the news channels. So it kept showing the news people talking their wag the dog BS, and then spent just a couple of minutes making a point and then went back to news channels. But it was a nice collection of all the stuff. And in one of the things I watched, it was a rare collection of actual footage of some bombs coming in, some sort of candid footage of people running from bombs that were exploding nearby and yelling in Aramaic or whatever that language they were speaking. I'm not sure what particular language it was, whether they were in Turkey or Syria or where they were and what they were speaking, but it was a local language, and they were running from bombs, and the bombs were blowing up around them, and you could see that something was going on. Didn't you know? So anyway, very little footage like that, but this was the only place I've seen yet that actually had a collection of 4 or 5 different images which showed some sort of real conflict going on, things people would be running from. So I thought that was very interesting that it's out there, but not very much, and no mainstream people show it. Because I think if it was pinned down to where that really is and what might have really been going on there, leaked out from the people that were there, who was really dropping those bombs on who, it's going to open up that can of worms that I'm talking about, where you got this mercenary army, ISIS, and they're over there, what Ken O'Keefe thinks, fighting for the Greater Israel project on behalf of the CIA and those people, and they very might well be, but I say it's a bigger situation where they're pushing back the Shias in the place where the new lines are to be drawn, and the Shias have no other choice but to fight, and so does Russia, because some of those new lines include the territory they want to keep, and that's what they're fighting over in their proxy wars right now. And with that, you've got all this bringing in a turkey, Dad. One of these from today, from Sunday, by Benjamin Harvey. Bloomberg Business has Erdogan signals Turkey prepared to join Syria war if asked. And what I thought was interesting in this article, first of all, points out, as everyone probably knows, the peace talks are suspended. Is that a surprise, Dad? What did I say last week? Are we going to peace? Or what did I say? Peace talks is just code for war. So the peace talks were suspended, unfortunately. Like I said, how could there be peace talks? These guys, who's talking about what? And that's what such BS. I want to just sort of interject as a parenthesis into our discussion on the mainstream media. Why wasn't anybody pointing out, like I was, that, what kind of peace talks are we expecting? Who's going to talk about peace? What grounds for peace is there? And instead, everybody was hyping peace talks. Who's going to be in the peace talks? Now you've got this idea that, you've got greater conflict. It looks like Syria's taken back Aleppo now, right? Nobody's talking peace. They're talking Russia's helping Syria take back Aleppo, which is flying in the face of Turkey and America and deepening the war. What peace is there? Why was anyone anticipating a peace talk, Dad? If this is all true, what we see 1 week later, that, sort of Russia's been loosening up the territory for the official government forces to be pushing back on the rebels. Well, we've been pointing out for months through our journalism that the danger in Russia's actions in Syria was that if they weren't going to stick to bombing ISIS targets, then they're going to be bombing the people we're funding. Well, if now we look a couple months later and the fact is the people we're funding aren't making more headway against the Syrian regime, but the Syrian regime, in fact, is making headway against the rebels, well, and they're saying it's because of the Russian assistance. Well, isn't that saying to our journalists who were informing us that, in fact, Russia has been fighting the people we've been funding. In other words, the proxy war now has been America and Russia. I mean, is this not a bad place to be? Where are the peace talks there between Syrian people if it's a proxy war between Russia's helping the Syrian government push back against the forces that we're funding? So if Russia and America aren't pulling back, what are the forces we're funding going to be talking about? They're each trying to gain headway. And if the people behind them are funding them, where's the peace talks? If they've got no common ground already to be talking about, okay, Assad, how about we draw a line here? But one side saying Assad must go. Assad's not going to talk about that. He's going to talk about what line can we draw. And if he's gaining ground, meanwhile, I mean, I don't know. I just want to throw in there that it seems a little absurd, Dad, that the journalism wasn't pointing out what to me seemed pretty obvious. Where's the grounds for peace talks? And now what do we see a week later? But that, and the deeper thing is what I really want to talk about, and this is bringing Turkey, all of a sudden back in the news. What are you doing in Syria? You're essentially an occupier, Idrogan said, addressing Russian President Vladimir Putin. So all this saber rattling, right? Turkey shoots down a Russian plane. Russian says you're going to pay for that. Turkey's just, who knew Turkey was so strong? I'm sure people on the inside did, but I'm saying the journalists have not been presenting that to me, Dad. They've been presenting Turkey as sort of a waffling, being told what to do. Turkey's now, been last few weeks, all of a sudden they're in the news. They're flexing their muscles. In another article, whether I've got it in here or not, I guess I'll mention it. They're a little PO'd, telling the U.S., hey, who are you supporting here? Supporting us, or you supporting these Turkish terrorists? Because, of course, us being the good peacemakers that we are, peacemaking gun makers, we're giving guns to their enemies, their Kurdish, who they call terrorists, who, to the Kurds, they're the freedom fighters, trying to keep their territory from being overrun by the Turkish authorities who just want to gain ground and get rid of any opposition, right? All these conflicts, and instead of real peacekeeping in which you'd think that you'd be keeping guns out of the hands of these people, Dad, right? And I don't know, I kind of want to, there's so much in each of these articles that can, I want to get into. There's this coalition, Gulf states said they'd be prepared to send in ground troops as part of an international coalition battling Islamic State. And it's funny, that comes at the end of talking about how it's the Syrian government that's pushing. It's the Syrian government that's making headway. Well, if it's the Syrian government that's making headway, the United Nations last week suspended its long-awaited peace conference in Geneva until later this month, after Syrian forces launched a major offensive against rebels, edging closer to retake the city of Aleppo. The talks came after 4 months of Russian airstrikes helped reverse the tide of the war in favor of Assad's military. Now, funny that it doesn't address what does that mean for a conflict with America, this proxy war. What's going on with these rebels now? Aren't we sending, doesn't that mean more guns that we're wasting our taxpayers' money with? More death, unnecessary, because Russia's fighting a war with us? You don't think that's going to come home to roost, Dad? You don't think these are the seeds of war being planted is kind of what I'm feeling right now in the headlines. These are the seeds of war, and it's over Syria. And one of the things I watched this past week on YouTube that I don't know which to mention, because there are a few different things I watched, and a couple of them were a little bit meh. and a couple of them were really insightful, even though they might have been monotonous or had parts that were sort of well-trod, stuff, but still there was some, solid insight in them. And, one of them had pointed out this, one of them pointed out how the way these proxy wars are lining up are so much like they have in the past. And all the saber rattling, these sort of things are becoming more predictable now, Dad. The way this stuff is, nobody's taking weapons out of anybody's hands. The weapons are all coming to the front, as I've been saying for months, that's what ISIS was meant to do, and all the propaganda at the time. And when Russia first came in, I still see that, and I'm still going to say that the war is not yet, but what one of these things brought in addition to the idea of all these proxy wars, was that they brought a couple of scriptures up. One was Matthew about wars and rumors of wars, but don't be alarmed because the end is not yet. That's where we are. The other scripture they brought in was Isaiah saying that Damascus would be destroyed, a ruinous heap, right? Okay, well, that hasn't happened yet, right? So, but I've been saying for many years, even before all this started, Dad, but very few people know except my friends that know me well, that I've been pointing out for years that it's kind of odd that you got these prophecies that point to things like Syria being a ruinous heap, and all of these wars and rumors of wars, and this Daniel prophecies, king of the north, king of the south, this false Messiah that's going to rise, this Mahdi that's going to rise, this Armageddon that's going to take place, all over there in the Middle East. And, where's all the conflict gone since 9/11? Where's all the buildup of military? Where's all the talk about terrorism? Just like the days of communism and all the talk of Russia and the Iron Curtain and the wall in Berlin and the scare of even Cuba with nuclear weapons and all that, right? Is it just a coincidence that the last 15, 20 years, it's all been military bases in Iraq, build up in Iraq and Afghanistan, Turkey, and the importance of that whole region, Saudi Arabia and Jordan, this Arab Spring and this destabilization, the fall of Gaddafi, all these wars and rumors of wars. Is that just a coincidence? I don't know, but for the people following the eschatological view, here's this, very interesting caveat that you have, the fact that Damascus, this, one of the most important cities in the world, that part of the world, and for the history of the world, is, eschatologically destined to become a ruinous heap and uninhabitable. And as you've predicted, or at least anticipated many years ago, Dad, could it be that all these weapons that they say that they have over there, that the West says to be scared of because they're storing up weapons, blah, blah, blah. Could it be that we know exactly where these certain depots are around Damascus? And that eventually what we're going to do is send our bombs to blow up weapons depots that are full of nuclear weapons, let's say. And that's going to result in Damascus being destroyed in a day and being uninhabitable. All I'm saying is it's coincidentally becoming less and less of science fiction, Orwellian, conspiracy theory, and more of a possibility in the news that I read. And so, I want to get back to the fact that Turkey, Dad, Turkey is Gog, the area of Turkey, the old Macedonian Empire, that's Gog of the ancient world. And so, major player at the end in the eschatological view. In the view of Ken O'Keefe, a supporter, another NATO ally in the play, I suppose to be the beneficiary, if that's possible, to say, give me this territory and you can have all the rest of that. Just don't take my chunk. Make me the Islamic rule, the moderate. I don't know. I don't know his position on Turkey. I'm just anticipating what it must be. But that's why I say his view doesn't go far enough. In the eschatological view, what is Turkey's role and Magog's role? I look at it as, they imagine they're going to be the caliph again. They're the one that's been promised or is being in the back rooms funded and promised, do what you're told. And eventually he's going to be promised, okay, now's your chance. Here's the weapons. Go take it. Right? And that's the battle that's going to ensue. The tidings that trouble the king of the north out of Daniel. Right? This king of the north that's going to return to find that after conquering Egypt and the Holy Land, to find that tidings out of the north and out of the east. Well, I think that's got to be Turkey, because Turkey's the one that they're going to say, okay, now's your chance. Now he's gone too far, or now he's fallen into the trap, or whatever it is. And that's what they're going to use the guns through Turkey. Now those guns have to come against Russian guns, as we can see. And so the Russian guns have to still be falling on the side of whatever's left of Syria right till the end, is what I'm imagining now, Dad, and Iran. Because by that point, there has to be this, this is the part we've been watching, right? And I'm still, notice Yemen's out of the headlines. Iran is out of the headlines in the sense of what these major points that they're showing. As I say, it's Turkey and the Russian situation there. The Pope is back in the headlines. Israel's stuff's in the headlines, but not the Shia struggle. See, that wanes constantly in the headlines. But I say that's what's going to really come to play, Dad, because Iran doesn't disappear just because the headlines wane. They have to protect their part in the world or get overrun. In their world, it's almost a genocidal position. The places they lose, they lose. And if it ever gets to the point where their empire is threatened, and I think one of the things that came up in this one of these videos I watched this week was this, what were they calling the Persian Crescent, I think, where they're demonstrating how this alliance of Russia and even China and Syria and Iran also has a play in this deeper, that they were trying to show it as a play against the dollar. That these guys are trying to use their ability to run pipelines through their countries and cut out Turkey and NATO countries, therefore cut out the dollar. These are the people that are able to set up a different, right? This BRIC system set up a different financial way of transacting outside of the dollar, pump their oil outside of the dollar. This is what this video I was watching was presenting. But what it didn't take into account that I didn't like is who's funding that, right? Because you can't do that. We go in and take out regimes like Saddam Hussein, no matter how many guns they got. We go in and change that kind of stuff. So if it's only on a level of that, those, Iran, and Syria and those places would fall quickly, just like Russia would have never been allowed to rebuild. That's why I say, Dad, you have to look on a deeper context that has to do with something like a William Guy Carr, or an eschatological view like an Imran Hossein, or Daniel's glasses, eschatological view, false Messiah, spirit of Antichrist. You have to go somewhere to find a deeper view of, okay, yeah, but who funded Russia? Who's allowing, not just allowing, funding this whole rise of a brick system, this whole rise of an antithesis that was predicted from possibly 100 years ago. That was the reason to put the Bolsheviks in there. We need an antithesis. We need an atheist system to go against all these godly people in the world that believe in a God. All these nations ruled by kings and priests that have to look to their scriptures and look to their gods before they do anything. The people following their gods. We need a system that's antithesis, right? Atheist, anti-God. So they fund it. And then they said, and if you look back, if you give a little bit of open mind to the idea that maybe it was predicted, well, it goes all the way back to the 1890s, possibly even the 1870s, that you have it being said we need a First World War to institute this atheistic system. Then a Second World War to give it some footing in the world. Give it an equal footing. That's what the whole Second World War was really supposed to be about. Two-sided benefit. One, you get your atheistic system put into place to fight your fascism. And you get your fascism to stimulate sympathy for your state of Israel by the Holocaust. They're going after the Jews, and the communists now get to be funded to go after them. And now you got your communists in the world, and you got your Jewish sympathy for the Holocaust. I mean, that's what it's claimed the Second World War was done on purpose for. Right? Now, I don't know if that's true. I'm just trying to fit all the pieces of the puzzle. And to me, the fact that there is a little bit of validity to all of that through the channels that we get that word and the facts on the ground, the way they played out in history, is pretty darn convenient. So, so anyway, and so looking at it that way, though, Dad, shows us that we have a built-in system on that level, on a deeper vision than just somebody trying to win. Because if that's the case, they already did win after World War II. They already did have all the power, and they knew it. And they took it away from Germany and Japan. And when the 80s, and if the communist thing was really real, which there's a lot more evidence to support that it was a fabricated boogeyman so that they could keep building weapons instead of go to peace. Because when they looked at it, they said, well, if we go to peace, we can't keep the upper hand. If we practice what we preach and put the guns away and let everybody do whatever they want to do, they might not want to buy from us. They might want to build their own weapons. They might want to build systems outside of our capitalistic system of control. What do we do then? How do we force them and keep our face value in the world of being freedom fighters? See, they thought about all that, Dad. They decided people have to be in fear of something. So what is it? Well, after World War II, it became communism, right? And even terrorism. At that point, it was terrorism through communism. These communists that would terrorize the world into their system. Once that was once it had run its course, which seems to have been the annihilation of the Orthodox Christians of that part of the world, they could move on into the next phase of it, which is why the Berlin Wall fell. That didn't just fall because a bunch of altruistic people decided to spend their money in it. I don't know. You could see it that way, just like the Arab Spring, But to me, I see it as another Arab Spring. It was an opportunity, because what came of it, Dad? The 90s. right? The 80s and the late, the whole deregulation, the banker takeover essentially of all the assets. That's what came of it. Before then, you still had sort of a breakup of the ability of the bankers to take over everything, because when they tried 100 years ago, if you remember, things like the Federal Reserve and all that got thrown out of everybody's country. They didn't want these banker shysters taking over their financial institutions, right? That's the history of our banking system. They were seen through. People fought against them. People fought to the death. That, I think McCormick was his name, of that one politician in America, the early days of the United States, when there were still some people willing to fight to the death against these systems threatening to take over what we were, hoping at the time was a system of self-rule and democracy and all that good stuff. Well, this guy fought to the death. They killed him finally because he was so outspoken and pointing out to the people what their system was bound to do. Well, he got dead and they got in. And it's been 100 years and they ain't been out since. So you go ahead and decide if their system's the one that's pulling the strings, or the altruistic guys that were fighting against them and have always had their, been silenced in one way or another. I say you don't even really get to hear much of the altruistic guys. Really, from inside the system, they're not really there. You get your, occasional Ross Perot thrown at you, or, Bernie Sanders or somebody maybe. One of these guys that's kind of seems like a good guy that's been fighting the good fight. But do they ever really get anything done? Does their side fighting the good fight ever do anything but sort of present the other side? So that I want to say in a I want to help, try not to be completely pessimistic, but I'm not so sure that it isn't. I'm not so sure that they're not the paid opposition. So that there's a controlled opposition. There's a way to paint the other side so that people can believe that they're getting their voice and can believe that they fought the good fight. Because otherwise you could have a real team of people that do that, and that's the one thing that could bring a system down. And so it's always presented that that's what they're doing. But then when you look at it all, these patriot parties and all these things of the past as they come through time, do they ever really change anything? Right? So I'm not sure there's any big money behind anything altruistic. It's always some little guy, and I think most of them are silenced before they can make much of a dent, anywhere, Dad. So anyway, so the pattern is so well set into place is I guess the point I'm trying to get at is all the knowledge in the world can't help you, just like it never could in the time of Christ, It was foolishness in the time of Paul, perhaps, and even in the time of Christ. It's always foolishness to the powers that be when you try and reckon the story that way. So these days, what we've got, in my view, that's important to look at, the fight in Israel that keeps going on, that Turkey being, rising to some sort of prominence, and I say it's got to be that final power. They're going to be the final power to come in as the NATO power to fight the king of the north in Daniel's vision at the end. The other thing I find interesting is North Korea suddenly, thrust to the front of the talk. They shot a rocket into space, claiming they're shooting off a satellite, and South Korea and the U.S. says we're mad. We're saying they're going against the nuclear test agreements, and I say this is all part of the setup, the wag the dog stuff, because, again, I read a few weeks ago, impoverished North Korea. These aren't people with a lot of money. I'm not sure who's banking on them to have a big military output that's going to get paid back in the end. Why is that what the international banking cartel have decided to do with North Korea through whatever channels? Because this brings me back to, I know where I was, Dad, talking about this whole divide of this BRICS system and this other dollar system. See, I say that that's a two-headed snake. That's not a real fight. That's why our journalism's presenting it as a real fight. Russia, what are we going to do about Russia? They jab this way, we counter that way. China, who are they going to go with? Iran is siding with this other side. I say that all could have been avoided 50 years ago, but wasn't on purpose. It's the way the history seems to come down to us. Because somebody doesn't want peace, because instead they've built up nothing but weapons, because instead they've been doing nothing but killing and taking over territory through killing, through this thesis and antithesis of, raising up a problem through someone like a Korea. Look at them, they just won't stop being bad boys, and now look at it, it's gone too far, will be the problem at some point. They'll incite the problem and then have to have the solution. Now that, I believe, is all waiting for World War III, so I think all of it at this point is just to plant seeds, that they have these weapons, that they have intention to do harm, that everybody's got to be on guard, that we need to essentially set up more weapons. South Korea's got to buy more stuff. America, whoever supports freedom and democracy, has to essentially spend more money on weapons to be ready for North Korea. So I mean, how far away, Dad, is that from a simple false flag event in a an all-out war state where you've got where China's over here in the South China Sea making everybody mad. North Korea's making everybody mad. Iran's making, when I say everybody, I mean on this other side, this NATO side that just wants peace. Of course, we just want peace. That's why we're the people who make all the weapons, right? And fund all these rebel armies everywhere. Saudi Arabia, through Yemen, through Iraq, Afghanistan, against Iran and the Shias, through this ISIS, whatever it is, through Al-Qaeda when it was Al-Qaeda's time, right? And as I've always pointed out, where's all that money come to stand against that money? If you're going to say that that's the only Western money source that comes down through the European money, through the Roman Catholic money, through the money that's been funding the international banking cartels since the 1600s that we know of. So a good 300 years or more of banking, more like 350 years. If you're going to say that there's another source equal to that can put up with that, to me, I think, Dad, that's the big question. I hope that our insight helps people ask themselves, because I see that out in the world with all the particular insights like the Ken O'Keefe. You never see Ken questioning the fact that Russia's money, that the same people that are killing the Palestinians have also paid to put the Palestinians in place to be killed. And they could withdraw that. There's a group of people who could really fund a different sort of system. And that doesn't mean Russia and America know they're playing on the same team. A few people in those organizations might, I imagine, how could you not see through it all? But I say the generals and the politicians and the people out blowing all the nationalistic paraphernalia, yeah, they think they're involved in real fights, and there are real fights because those fights are funded and weaponized people die and it makes other people hurt. And those people want to lash back, right? That's why, my point isn't that it's that the whole fight is Hollywood. It's that the explanation is Hollywood. The fight is real, man. Those weapons are dropping, but who they dropping on, see? Who they killing? And they've been all along now, World War I, killing Christians over there. World War II, killing Jews and Christians still, because that never stopped. All the way up through the modern day into the 90s. It took them to finally get rid of, all the way through Kosovo. And all of these atrocities have been a matter of that same line of thinking. You got to get rid of, because why does Daniel use the words, Dad, in our eschatological view of uproot? Why is that the vision of Daniel? This little, then in his vision, he turns his attention to this little horn that comes up among 10 and causes 3 of the first to be plucked up by their roots. Now, we've seen what that looks like. Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi. I keep having this weird feeling. Does that mean Egypt was one of those roots? And those were the 3. And Syria is part of this end game that ends in the complete destruction of Damascus. Assad's on this east-west team, this east, terrorist, good guy, bad guy, white horse, black horse team. He's being painted on the black horse team with Russia and Iran, Syria, China, Brazil, North Korea, the BRICS nations, right? They're all on the black horse team coming toward Armageddon. That seems to be a pretty clear thing. It's divided on a Shia line. It's divided on this atheistic line that they put into the world and got into China. China was never atheistic, just so you know, Christians. They weren't Christian necessarily, though there was plenty of Christian missionaries, and the missionization of China goes back into history. So don't believe a lot of Christianity wasn't wiped out in China at that time. But China itself, through Confucius, I mean, come on, all the way back you had General Mao, and Maoism became a Chinese philosophical school of thought, and Mao premised an actual deity, God, that Confucius and others just sort of pointed to in a more esoterical way, calling it heaven and such, and pointing to a deeper, practically illuminating another dimension, another scheme, an interconnected realm called heaven, in which the earth was sort of this vision of, or replica of, or extension of, and why the balance must be maintained, because it's not just material, it extends into something that is called heaven. Well, Mo came along and gave that and said, well, it's heaven with a God. There's a deity, there's an actuality involved in that makes it such. That Confucius's problem was not in seeing that you couldn't have what Confucius wanted in a validatable otherness that was cohesive and was the plan or the pattern or the ultimate reality beyond the seen reality, and just have that exist out of nowhere, out of the ether, at least in Mo's view. And so you have, as old as what was Chinese culture, an examination and belief in God, and an absolutely spiritual culture that was destroyed. So that's what I want to always bring attention to. That was funded on purpose, and I can't ignore this idea of a prediction that they needed to fund that. They needed to fund this otherness, this antithesis, this communist atheist type of force in the world that would eventually be set against the Christian force in the world, and that's what we're coming to on a certain level. That's not this deeper Antichrist level. That's not the spiritual level. That's the physical level, right? And that's the one that Ken O'Keefe is wrapped up in this Zionist movement, because he just doesn't realize that on that level, those people, those bankers are using Zionism as much as they're using Islam, as much as they're using Russia, as much as they're using NATO, because there's only one bank that it all goes back to for the last 350 years. And they get their way in the world and have. That there is no, even up to 1966, or as early, as late as, when we look back now, as late as 1966, Professor Quigley says, there's no nation on earth beyond their reach of control. So that means Russia, China, Korea, Brazil. And funny enough, all these countries that I'm mentioning are countries that were broke and brought into line long before. Who are we fighting today? Syria seems to be this, if I can just, I guess, Dad, try and go out on sort of a mystical note. Syria is that place of the old contention. Nineveh, the king of Assyria, the Assyrian, right? The seed of Satan, if you will. The source in the world of the physical manifestation of all that would bring itself against God in the end, if you want to look at it on that deeper play, on that final scale of what might be going on an eschatological view. That land there is why, that is where the power of the prince of the power of the air has been centered since the times of, Noah, perhaps. Certainly since the times, I say, of Assyria and what we would call the modern cycle, or the latest cycle of existence, right? Coming out of wherever it came out of, the flood, and into the modern world of Egypt and Assyria and Babylon, and into that modern world that would become the patriarchs and such. So that territory goes back to that oldest possible land, possibly even where they lived after the garden, let's say. Maybe that's what if you, again, I want to just stay on this mystical. Let me just be out there, floating out there in la la land, okay? I'm not presenting this as facts, except to those people whose minds can go out that far and nod their head and say, yeah, maybe. I'm just saying that there is such a story and a possible reconciliation to the fact that it all happens in Damascus, and that Syria is this final thorn that is like, if you will, a fulcrum of a balance beam of, I feel like almost like these two horses or two children on a seesaw, right? The black horse and the white horse, or whatever, a tug of war. And the center of that fulcrum happens to have always been, in the earthly sense, there over Syria, Damascus, Nineveh, and Israel, let's say, if it extends down to there. But I think that's why Syria is where it's coming out of, and why that's the last place, and why we can look for, in the sense of an eschatological or even a human earthly view of the end of time, or a final battle, or the end of this human cycle in a Hopi Indian kind of vision, or whatever, the coming of the red and blue planets, is because, look at it. Here we are, the battleground where these sides are being chosen up, and it's going to come about over Syria. These sides that are being funded for the last 100 years on purpose, perhaps, are coming together over a ground that just happens to extend back to the times of the flood and the times of the first people of God and the times of the first church and all these things, I mean, is that coincidence? I doubt it. Does it, is it really meaningful in the modern sense of watching the news? I don't know, but it happens to be. Russia and China and Iran seem to be going to center around this Assad regime, or this Shiite enclave or swath of land remaining in Syria. That seems to be where the final line, that they're not going to give up, perhaps part of Iraq, because look who's come into view now, Dad, as the leader of the people of Iraq again, after all these years of what's gone in Iraq, is Shia, siding with Iran, asking for Russia's help, so that there's the potential for this, and I say it's nothing more than the trying to get this balance more or less equal, so that what's been prophesied can come true. They'll destroy each other. They can mutually destroy each other, which suits everybody's plan. I mean, it fits everybody's projected outcome, whether it's the one in the world of a guy like Ken O'Keefe looking for the people that are funding the state of Israel to wipe out all the Arabs over there so that they can set up the state of Israel, whether you're looking at it from the materialists or the people that are that say the elitists are just trying to wipe out, cause the war so they can depopulate and start again. Well, it certainly looks like they're presenting a certain confrontation that can bring that about. And instead of putting their money into stopping all this and saying, hey, wait, I'm not going to fund making more planes. Hey, Russia, wait a minute, back down. Hey, Turkey, sit back. Hey, America, let's all put our planes in the hangar for a minute, right? Look at the potential here. We could wind up at war. We could wind up in some, in the killing of hundreds of thousands or millions of people and destruction of all these incredible historical places. Why isn't that, the primary narrative that everybody's really, and for me, Dad, I'm saying, why hasn't that been for, months before? Like I said, before Russia got in, when I was pointing out how we're just stumbling into this. Oh, we never anticipated that Russia would go look after its number one ally in the region, where it has its only bases outside a Russian, influenced area. Of course they're going to. So why weren't we already, through journalism, through foresight, through, peacekeeping and peace process and all that, pointing out that, hey, let's start sitting down over this area of Syria, over the Shiite Sunni situation, the caliphate situation. These are all historical issues. They're on the table. They're not secret things that just conspiracy theorists and nuts like me are talking about. These are real issues. It's on the King of Jordan's website. The idea about the caliphate. It's obviously a big enough deal for ISIS to get involved. Turkey has a claim and has claimed the caliphate and the right to that for years. These are realistic issues. Not to get to the point where you don't start talking until people are shooting other people's airplanes down. Why would that even be allowed to get to that state first? I've been saying this for several months now, Dad. Why are we even at this point? But even at this point, when it really starts to become clear, whoa, now, Turkey's ready to jump in, Russia and Turkey. Okay, come on. It's easy to start seeing this big confrontation coming where you got Iran, China, Russia, part of Iraq. All these people have a reason to join force against this other group. That's so anyway, you got to see that that's what's sort of coming in many ways as far as the projections. That's the most, if you had to bet, you'd have to bet that what's coming is bigger conflagration, not, suddenly all these people, like when it reminds you of one of those Westerns when that moment comes when something happens and everybody pulls their, cocks the hammer back and everybody's got their guns pointed at each other with the hammer cocked back, and you can feel the tension when nobody wants to shoot, because then you get a big shootout where the guns just start flying. But that's often in Western what happens, A, because it's more dramatic, and B, because unfortunately, once you've let tensions get built to the point where everybody's cocking their hammer instead of everybody, sort of still having a cool head, that's a tough position to back down from. And so if you can imagine that perhaps it's being engineered into that position, that becomes kind of scary and creepy. You talk Orwellian, but show me again. Then you have to answer for where's the money going to Russia, to China to be a big threat. Why would as this one video I started this vein of thought mentioning that's trying to point out that it's all this fight on the dollar. Russia's fighting the dollar. China, they're going to fight the dollar. Iran's going to join them. They're all going to fight the dollar. Well, yeah, I think that's kind of true. And that is what's going to bring about World War III on an economic level, because it has to be on that level also. What I'm saying on our insight, Dad, is I think that's being played. I think that's being done on purpose, right? That's part of how you get to such a drastic stage as what we're anticipating, is that Americans, Europeans, people who depend on the dollar for stability have to be shown what can happen or what will happen. I mean, again, if you're going to go to the prophetic view, that Babylon system crashes in a day and all the merchants of the world stand afar off and, are afraid to even approach it for what might happen and say, how can this possibly be that everything's been, all that money, all that wealth destroyed in a day? So if that prophecy is a fact and a true, reflection of the future, as people who, monotheists who believe in the prophecies imagine it is, what can that be saying? We've interpreted or anticipate it means the Western financial system crashing, kind of in the way that's prophesied even up through a person like Nostradamus prophesied such a crash. And so how does that come to be? What kind of world are you living in when that happens, and how does that affect people and the hostility angle? And so when you're building it in through these alternative medias like this thing I watched, where that's really the deeper, like they're presenting it, because this was alternative media, and they're presenting it as that's the deeper angle. Russia and China are trying to take over the world essentially with Iran through the economic play. And I simply point out that if that was possible, I doubt that would have gotten to this stage. If you imagine how easy that was to conceive 50 years ago, and how easy it was to see the necessary, milestones that would need to be reached, like, an armament capability, along with a financial capability, right? So as you watched those things come into place, you'd think you would have, made some moves. And we know they would have, because they, as I say, they talked about being a superpower and how to keep it. Anyway, so I know I'm starting to talk around in circles, Dad. I just think that there's a lot of interesting veins to talk about on both an eschatological and a material level going on right now, with the important ones being, the the Zionistic movement, which you can see going on through these type of articles. They continue to build, they continue to push. The whole EU can be against it, doesn't matter. Why? Well, because they're supposed to push. Remember, they're fomenting, if you believe this Albert Pike letter concept, they're fomenting a war between Islam and Israel that will mutually destroy each other, not just a conflict meant to mutually destroy each other. So, read that into it perhaps. And then Turkey, what are they, why are they becoming so prominent? What's going on with Turkey? Well, they always have been prominent. They're where the seven churches are in Asia, right? From an eschatological view. They're the place that Russia was promised Constantinople that was taken from them. So there's a issue there that's been brewing between them and Russia, with them knowing that if Russia were to win in the end, they're coming after Constantinople that they were promised 100 years ago before the Bolshevik Revolution. So there's all these pressure points right now, and Turkey being Magog, and Turkey having a meaning, Magog meaning they have a part in the prophetic view as coming in at the end of this Armageddon, which means they have to be powerful enough to do so. And also they have this worldly part of being the last caliph and a claim on being the future caliph, the moderate caliph that's already, made friends with Israel and all that kind of stuff. They've got that going on for them, and why they're destined to be part of our future now for the rest of the future, I believe. One of the other articles I had, I don't think I have time to talk much about it. Sorry if I've gone on too long. It's out of the AP from, this might be Saturday. It says 23 hours ago, and I'm recording this on Sunday the 7th, so it just says 23 hours ago. AP by Karen Laub. Turkey under pressure as Syrians mass at border. And so this brings us back to our refugee issue and how Turkey's been given a fortune by Europe, or is being constantly given this fortune to deal with the refugees. How they got 2.5 million of them in their country. And so again, it just shows the importance of Turkey as a pressure point in all of this. They're the ones taking on all these refugees. They're being paid to do so. They're being paid. See, they're a real like a worker in the old mafia sense, right? And they're looking for their promotion, is the way I see it. And they're probably being promised one by the powers that be. Why they're working so hard is the way I see it. And so Turkey's a major factor. There's going to be a lot going on and coming out of there. I'm sure, Dad, as we watch the future. So I think if one of these other articles with the Pope, I think I'll wait and talk about it next week, because I think some stuff's liable to develop, and I want to read more about this story, because on the surface, I don't believe it. They're getting together to stop the persecution of Christians. I'll mention it now, just the idea that there is this persecution of Christians in the Middle East to such an extent that for the first time in 1,000 years, the pontiff of the Catholic Church and the leader of the Orthodox Christian Church are ready to sit down and talk, put their differences aside and talk about how it is they can stop persecution of Christians in the Middle East. So that's going to play into our future also even more. But I think this is just starting to become an issue. And it has to become more of an issue, but I think this really has more to do with the Catholics' position on the future of the Middle East, and not and the objection by the Orthodox Christians and the continued war will go on there. And so anyway, I want to explore that at another time, because there's a lot of issues I'm looking into on that. But it is now in the headlines, and I wanted to point out that I'm aware of it, and I think it's all part of our watch and part of this, because of this Trinity sort of thing that has to go on with the Temple Mount, and how the Greek Orthodox Church has got to be part of the people that speak up against that, I imagine, and are persecuted in the end, and make friends with the Jews, or the the ones that get persecuted with the Jews that realize that Jesus is the Messiah right at the end. So I think all that's going to have a real pertinent place. And the last one, I don't know if I have time to talk about it, Dad. It was from a CNBC article from Sunday the 31st. It was from a week ago. Saudi Arabia struggles to cope with cheap oil. Yeah, Dad, it's just that this Saudi oil thing, to me, is going to become important, because we know that Saudi Arabia eventually is going to be in a position of getting turned on. They're used right now for all the funding and of all this terrorism that's going on, but there's going to come a time when that's going to become a real hinge, and the good caliph is going to take over that, and I think that's part of why that whole the Saudi kingdom's always been able to be, the whole the Wahhabi regime was based on being radical, and the kingdom was supported as radical, even though it doesn't make any sense from our political and standpoint at all, that we support them in the region and don't make any demands on their progression toward a more moderate stance. But it does, if you think of it in the idea that they've been groomed to be the radical, so that they can be used at this time and all through time to fund terrorism and to do all those things. And then when the time comes, they can be pointed at as a patsy and they can be turned on. And right now they're kind of being driven broke while we're sucking all the oil out of them, right? They're keeping up oil production, and they're having to cut back on all the spending, which keeps them sort of their people happy, this welfare state. And so anyway, it's I think that it's going to play into I think that what's going on with oil right now is part of what's going on in destabilizing Saudi Arabia, or it's linked to it. It's a benefit of it. They know that that's happening over there. Iran, I don't think matters so much, because Russia and Iran and all these places, they're being set up to have the weapons, to have the capability at their time. And so Saudi Arabia has the weapons from our side. They don't need to, they have to worry about their ability to keep doing the funding of the radicals that want to take their country back. So as soon as they can't do that, or as soon as we pull that, and if we can blame it on economic issues because of oil or such, anything like that, right? It makes it easy for us to pull our support for Saudi Arabia. So yeah, the CNBC article, Dad, to conclude, says the global rut of oil prices has taken its toll on the kingdom's bottom line. The country's been forced to cut government spending in its upcoming budget and increase production of crude oil, even though it's hardly worth pulling it out of the ground. Still, the world's largest producer of oil appears on a crash course for bankruptcy as early as 2018, according to a new Big Crunch analysis. Many oil-dependent nations are having to dig deep to balance budgets, with crude oil fetching so little on the global market. Money-rich nations like Qatar and Kuwait look to be getting by, while poorer nations like Libya have descended further into strife and civil war. Oil would need to be selling for $2.69 a barrel for Libya to balance its budget, according to the IMF. Saudi Arabia is somewhere in between. So think of how, think of the precarious nature. I mean, poor Libya, right? Boy, they were one of the most stable nations in the world, before this whole NATO intervention. But think of that, Dad. According to the IMF, $2.69 a barrel. So how screwed is poor Libya? And what kind of picture does that say for the future of Saudi Arabia is what I'm trying to say, that they're sucking all their oil out of the ground. That's how they're taxing Saudi Arabia here at the end for all the years of, letting them be the radical country and do whatever they want and make the millions of dollars. Oh, yeah, well, they're paying the piper now, aren't they? They're sucking their oil out of the ground, cutting back their budget, and at some point, these guys are saying in a couple of years, they're bankrupt. What's that going to mean for keeping the wolves at bay? So anyway, Dad, that's what I've got this week. Thanks for having me on the show. Talk to you next week.
Well, Tony, I think you're exactly right. And it was another superb analysis of this week's happenings in the news in the Middle East. And folks, I hope you enjoyed the show today. And give us a little feedback. Go to BroSal.org on YouTube or the Philadelphian Church on YouTube. And comment, drop us a line, subscribe. And if you like what you're hearing and you want this to continue, drop us a frankincense offering. There's a button right up on the right-hand corner of the title to keep this ministry and the word coming to you. And for Tony, I'm Brother Sal. Till next week, we want you to have a great day in Christ. Thank you.